Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rahima Kavuga, and I serve as the Synod Relations Manager for Lutheran Church Extension Fund. Thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar. Before we begin, I just want to remind you of a few house rules for this presentation. So you are muted and will be muted throughout the presentation. If you're having any issues or if you have questions, which we will have time at the end for, we encourage you to drop that into the chat box, and we will make sure to get those answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and will be sent out about a week or so after our presentation here today. And so if there's anyone in your congregation or community that was unable to attend, or that you feel that this is a great presentation for them to listen, we encourage you to share this with them. And it'll also be available through all of our social media platforms as well. So before we begin, would you please join me in a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, I thank and praise you for your bountiful goodness, Lord. And in the midst of a chaotic world, that you sent your Son to save us. And Lord, that in this time we would look to you. I thank and praise you for the gifts of your servants in the church, especially those who will be presenting today. I ask that you would be with them, guide them in their presentation, and may all who hear it learn more about it and be closer to you. All this I pray in your name. Amen. Let me introduce our two speakers. Reverend Sutton is the associate pastor and just accepted a call to be the senior pastor at St. Luke Lutheran Church in Lansing, Michigan. He's also a PhD student at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. He has an MA in digital rhetoric from Michigan State University, and his most recent books include Clearly Christian, Following Jesus in the Age of Confusion, and Authentic Christianity, How Lutheran Theology Speaks to a Postmodern World. Sutton's writings have appeared in the Washington Post, Religious News Service, the Gospel Coalition Sightings, Outreach Magazine, and elsewhere. Seth Hinz lives in St. Louis, and for 12 plus years, he has worked in communications within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod for churches, schools, universities, districts, and national ministries. As a StoryBrand certified guide, he works with nonprofits and entrepreneurs to develop narrative-based messaging and marketing strategies that move people to take action. And we are so thankful to have both of them with us. So at this point, I will pass it on to Reverend Sutton.
Wonderful. Welcome. It is a privilege and a joy to be here with you today. And I know that your time is valuable. So I hope that these words are a benefit to you. I've got a slide here with my email address on it. We can advance to that. If you got any questions, follow up, want to throw digital tomatoes at me, feel free. You can do it that way through my email address. Now, I want to get started with a story. Several years ago, I was teaching confirmation class. As I usually do, I asked one of my students to read a Bible verse out loud. The young man said, "Sure, I'll do that." He found the particular Bible verse, was just about to read it, and then he said, "My Bible died." Now, that's a strange thing to say, but what's even weirder is I knew exactly what he meant when he said, "My Bible died." He was reading the Bible on a tablet. The battery of the tablet died, and thus his Bible died. Now, think about that for a moment. 50 years ago, or 500 years ago, that would have been a nonsensical thing to say. In the Middle Ages, Bibles didn't die. But now, at this moment in time, we could say, "My Bible died," and that means something. In the history of Bible reading, this is the only time that that sentence would ever make sense. And I share this with you today because it gives us a glimpse into the intersection of the Christian faith, the life as the church, and technology, how these two things come together. So I'm going to give you an overview of my presentation. I've got 3 key points. We are going to fly through them fairly quickly. I'm used to giving these presentations in the course of an hour or a couple hours, and got about 15 minutes. So the first one is this, techne. It's important for us to realize that this conversation we're having is a conversation that predates the modern age. This conversation about technology goes way back, back to classical philosophy, back to antiquity. For example, Aristotle and other classical philosophers talked about techne. That was the broad domain under which technology finds its place. So this conversation's been going on for generations about technology. And in it, we have things like art, craft, doing, making, things like that. Now, as we're getting our bearings on technology here, what is technology? We can go back one slide. What is technology? If you ask modern scholars for a definition of technology, you're going to get a whole mess of responses. So there's not a unified answer for what technology is. One that I often use comes from a scholar named Langdon Winter, and he calls technology modern practical artifice. So it's modern. We're often thinking about things that are recent, cutting edge, new, futuristic, but that's not all that technology is. Technology includes ancient things as well. We're thinking about things that are practical. So when we're talking about technology, we're talking about useful things, tools, things that are instrumental. You're using a piece of technology to accomplish another task. It's not an end to itself, but a means to an end. And then it's artifice. When we're talking about technology, we're talking about things that have been produced, created, crafted, things like that. But there's yet other dynamics to technology, others that I would have us think about as we enter into this conversation. Technique. You notice the similar etymology there, technology, technique. They're part of this conversation of techne. Technique has to do with things that are maybe non-physical, method or craftsmanship or skills, but that's part of this understanding of technology. Design. When we're talking about technology, we're talking about things that have been created. There's a vision behind it. A creator has that vision. It's planned. It's purposeful. And then lastly, humans. In the study of technology, this is a more recent emphasis in the last couple decades, but the interface of humans when it comes to technology, that we're talking about user-centered design and human-computer interaction. So technology, we're talking about things that are new, but also things that are ancient. That which you hold in your hand, something physical, but that which you hold in your head, technique. And then also non-human things, which we often think about technology, but then the humans, us, who interacts with this technology. Moving on, Scripture talks a lot about technology, and this may not be readily apparent to us, but once you start understanding that technology is broader than just Zoom meetings, you realize the Bible's full of references. So I've got a couple references here, some that are positive references. We can go back one. Positive references where God is commissioning technology to be created, something to be made. We also have some negative examples where technology, a crafted thing, becomes an idol. One of my favorite quotes from Scripture, or verses from Scripture, is Bezalel. That's that verse there from Exodus 31, I believe it is, where we hear that the Spirit of God enables Bezalel to have ability and intelligence, craftsmanship to make things, to create technology, you might say. Paul talks about technology. Again, we look at this and say it's ancient stuff, but it was technology in his day. Books and parchments, things that media he was using to proclaim the gospel. Luther talks about technology. Kind of interesting. This is just one of many references that Luther has, but he invites us to think about tools. For him, it was needles, thimbles, beer barrels, things like that. But to use these things, and on the next slide, we see he says, use them in a way that is to the benefit of the neighbor. He says, use me in your relations with your neighbor, just as you'd want your neighbor to use his property or her property in relation with you. So Luther talked about technology, just as Scripture did. Modern scholars have obviously continued this conversation. Robert Johnson is a teacher at Michigan Tech in Michigan, northern Michigan. And he talks about technology like this. I think it's helpful. It has a ripple effect. You can go back one. It's got a ripple effect. And so that technology changes its immediate context, but it also ripples out and it changes the world in kind of unforeseen ways. So text messaging is an example. Text messaging was made to change how we communicate on the phone with one another. But text messaging has now rippled out and it's changed the English language. LOL, IDK, IKR, a smiley face. Maybe you knew this, but semicolons used to be used to connect two independent clauses. Now semicolons are made to give us winky faces, right? That's an example of technology changing not just the immediate context, but the broader context. Kind of talking about the power of technology shaping the world. John Culkin, he's worked with Marshall McLuhan a lot, but he says we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. So technology shapes its immediate context, but it also shapes the broader world and it shapes us as we use it. So that's a fast flyover of techne and technology, what we're talking about. It's an ancient conversation, but it obviously has continued on into the present. My next topic that I want us to think about is this, the senses, particularly the bodily senses, and how media and technology alters our senses. So we just talked about how it shapes us. This might be a way that technology is shaping us individually, but also collectively. To talk about this, I'm going to show you a picture here. This is by the Flemish painter Clara Peters, and it's called Still Life with cheeses, almonds, and pretzels. Every time I look at this, it makes me hungry and thirsty. But as you look at this, I want you to think about things in the foreground and things in the background. You see all these different things. You've got cheeses, pretzels, goblets, vessels, almonds, a knife, all of that. Some are foregrounded, some are backgrounded, some are obvious, and some not so much. For example, on the next slide here, you can see some backgrounded things in this painting. For instance, she has painted herself, a self-portrait, in the reflection on the lid. She's also etched her name, her signature on this knife. It's in the background. It's not very obvious to us at first glance. Now hold on to this idea because as we talk about the senses, we're going to talk about the bodily senses and technology and how some are foregrounded and some are backgrounded. Some of our senses get a lot of playtime and some of our bodily senses are left to the sides. So going on here, the senses. Martin Luther talks about the bodily senses, memorable words from the Small Catechism. God has made us. We are creatures. We have a body and soul, eyes, ears, members, reason, and all my senses. So Luther would say that we are sensory creatures, sensory creatures. Now, obviously, as we think about the senses, we can go to the next slide there. We think about the five senses. And that's sort of what we're talking about. Hearing, touch, sight, smell, taste. It's worth noting, as I've studied this and gotten into it more, the five senses, those being ordered and divided that way, that comes from Aristotle. But that's not an agreed upon thing by all scholars and philosophers. Others have ordered and numbered the senses beyond five. There's more than five senses. Modern neuroscientists have not limited to just five. But for our purposes, we'll talk largely about the five senses, the five bodily senses. Now, as we think about this, why are we talking about the senses? Marshall McLuhan, media theorist, he talked a lot about the senses and how media and technology interacts with them. So he says this. The extension of any one sense alters the way we think and act, the way we perceive the world. So if you change one of your bodily senses, all the other senses sort of change with it. We're used to this maybe with someone who doesn't have eyesight, who's blind. They have an incredible sense of touch and things like that. So the senses get rearranged based on that. McLuhan also says that media is an extension or a self-amputation of our physical bodies. Now, this is kind of abstract, but let's unpack it a little bit. We can go back one, actually. What McLuhan says is the senses are altered and changed as we interact with technology. So you're driving a car and your foot touches the pedal. And that connection from your foot to the pedal is translated, it's extended through the drivetrain, ultimately to the wheels of the car. And now the wheel and your foot are connected, they're extended. And McLuhan says this is what technology does, what media or mediums do. But he also says that as we do this, it's changing our body and our experience in the world. So that we can now go to the next slide. When we interact with technology, some of our senses are engaged and others are backgrounded. For example, the young lady with the headphones, ears and auditory and sound. She's engaging the hearing, but the other senses are maybe put in the background. So one part of her is extended far away, wherever she's listening or whatever she's listening to, but the rest of her body is there in that place. Right now, you're watching me and hearing me. So my voice and my face is being extended far away, wherever you're watching, but not all of me. Sounds strange, but you can't smell me, can't taste me, whatever that is. You can't touch me. So there's one sense coming, but not all the senses. They're rearranged and they're altered. Your body's in one place, mine's here, but they're connected. Same thing with radio. You talk about the disembodied voice. So it's a voice, but not a body. And that's what media does and technology does. It extends the senses, it rearranges the senses, it kind of disrupts the senses. Now, the next slide, we have common sense. Common sense. And that's a familiar phrase, I'm sure, for all of us. I'm not talking about like Ben Franklin aphorisms. A penny saved is a penny earned, or you can pick your friends and you can pick your nose, but you can't pick your friend's nose, which I think was Ben Franklin, I'd imagine. But common sense, what I'm actually talking about is sensus communis, which is where we get the idea of common sense. But it's the harmony of the senses, or the integration, the communion of the senses. And so what this is your eyes, your ears, your hands, your nose, your mouth, all your senses working together in harmony to give you common sense, being in the world, you might say, sort of like Luther says, all my senses. And so that we are created by God to be sensory beings, to have common sense, the integration of the senses. Now, this has kind of helped me think through the past year with the pandemic, the way that we've had to do some things differently when it comes to engaging technology for the church, for worship, for Bible study, for proclamation of the gospel. So this chart here, I've got different senses. Obviously, you can see those, and I have different kind of technologies that the church has used historically or maybe more recently. And you'll notice that each of these technologies or these parts of the liturgy connect to a different sense. So the speakers or a pulpit, that's heavy on the ears, the auditory. Cameras, candles, stained glass, that's very visual. You see this. Tactile, there's kneelers. You can feel that weight on your knees. The font and the water of baptism, hugs, handshakes. I don't know what those things are anymore, but I remember them vaguely. Chemical, tasting and smelling. But there's the chalice and patens, incense, the Lord's Supper. And all of these things engage the senses in a different way. And together they create common sense, this sensus communis. That is a very rich and full experience of worship together. And this has really helped me to understand sort of how technology is interacting with the Christian life. And it's helped me to understand why some people say the things they say about technology in the life of the church. For instance, I'm sure you've heard this before, someone talking about worship or Bible class, doing it online, and they'll say, that was really comforting, but something was missing. They'll say, I love being able to hear the word of God proclaimed, but it's just not the same as being in person. And I think in some sense, this is revealing, those comments are revealing how one part of our sense is being engaged, but not the whole sense. We don't have common sense. And so certainly what this is, I think, showing is the possibilities for technology, the ways in which we can extend our eyes and our ears, extend the word of God thousands of miles away, have this conversation we're having now, but how it's different. It's disrupted and changed. It's great in some aspects, but there's not a fullness to it that we're still longing for. That leads me to my last point, one that I want to make rather briefly. But technology has its limits. It has its limits. It certainly has its possibilities and its affordances, but it also has its limits. 3 slides real quick here. Proverbs, we hear that we are to seek discretion from God, wisdom from God. And so I'm often telling people we should approach technology critically. And by critically, I don't mean negatively, but critically in the sense that we are constantly evaluating it and assessing it. The next one from Corinthians, the invitation for us to recognize just because we can do something doesn't always mean we should do it. Certainly there's many things we can do because of technology, but it is incumbent upon the people of God to have the conversation we're having, to prayerfully and collectively wrestle with these things to figure out what is to the benefit of the kingdom and what is something we're doing just because we can do it. And then last one, every time I talk about technology, I think I always bring this verse up in some way. But the words of John the Baptist in John chapter 3, talking about Jesus, he says, he must increase, but I must decrease. And I think that's a spirit we should have when it comes to technology, that we should always ask the question, how is this to the increase of Christ, to the increase of the gospel proclaimed, and to the kingdom of God, and not just the increase of technology or the increase of stuff we've made, but to the increase of Christ. And as we have this conversation about Christ at the center of technology, this would be a filter and a question, and a thing we should always have at the forefront of our hearts and our minds. So thanks for letting me share some of these words, and I appreciate you being part of this conversation.
That's great. Thank you, Trevor, for that. It certainly is. I like the way that they've structured this webinar because Trevor has put a lot of thought and consideration and wisdom into how he approaches technology. And on the flip side, I sometimes go in bull in a china shop and then sort it out later. So thank you, Trevor, for setting us up for this discussion and diving into that technology understanding. So appreciative for it. With that said, my name again is Seth Hinz. I work in St. Louis for a church down here, and I work in marketing communication for churches and schools, and have been thinking about this, engaging online and building community online for my career, which is now 12 years, I believe. So that's where I'm coming from. When I began my career, Facebook was just launching, and so I've been kind of dabbling in and understanding community ever since then. And trying to understand it, and it's always changing. So I hope this conversation helps you maybe ask new questions, see what you already are doing and how can that overlap with maybe a new idea that comes up. But I really want to talk about how community is made, how relationships are started online, and just start us thinking about what may be next for us. So first, I start with being there. And for me, that starts with a story about a lawn bag. And I love sharing this story, and I've shared it a few times here and there, but this lawn bag, it frustrated me to no end because I would be sitting in Michigan at the time, raking leaves in the fall, pulling the rake as much as I could, and then like pinning against my arm, and then lifting leaves up and putting them into the bag only to have it collapse in on itself. And then the leaves would go all day. And that doubled my time, if not tripled my time, trying to get leaves off my grass. So what did I do? I hopped over to Google And I typed in, how do I keep lawn bags open? In my front yard, I was sitting there and I was typing this into my phone. And the first thing that came up was these results. And you can see immediately which one I clicked, because I could see 2 minutes and 21 seconds. And I thought, I can commit that 2 minutes to possibly solve this problem that is frustrating me beyond all belief. And so up popped Tom. And Tom spent 2 minutes and 21 seconds explaining to me how to build this elaborate PVC pipe structure that was very complicated, overly complicated, super frustrating to even think about building. But I was so appreciative that he had thought about it. So why do I bring this up? So lawn bags, like, what's the point of that? My contention is that being there, being online, helps us start relationships, develop relationships, and nurture relationships. I did not buy PVC pipe from Home Depot, but when I needed lawn bags next, can you guess where I went? I went straight to Home Depot, to which I am not paid to say. But I did find, while I was looking for lawn bags, a brand new convention, the Leaf Lawn and Care Bag Chute, which has revolutionized the way that I rake leaves. It has made everything simple, and I love it. And I also take pictures with it and post it on social media because I'm so thrilled with this simple solution, $8 solution. So why do I say that? There are new realities here. Which ones? I would say the relationships start online. Trust is built online. Somebody being there in my, I'll say it probably several times, there's a 0 moment of truth. And that is the Google search results page. When I search something in my moment of need, who pops up? And so whether it's lawn bags or whether it's forgiveness, whether it's an issue going through a divorce, whether it's something more serious than lawn bags, who is going to be there in my 0 moment of truth? And so for us as a church, I think we need to recognize that if we are not there, somebody will be there to answer the question. So I just want to always challenge myself and challenge us to think about, what are the questions that are out there? If we're not answering them, who is answering them? Somebody will be there. I also want to reflect on the fact that we are guides in this new online community, and it's important for us to stay healthy, keeping Christ at the center. And then I also want to talk briefly about on-ramps, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So first up, relationships start online. This is from Meredith Gould's book, Social Media Gospel. It is a fantastic book about help you think through this sort of thing. She put forward the trajectory of engagement, which I think holds true no matter what those little boxes say. So right now it says relationship starts in a social media interaction, whether that's on Twitter, whether that's on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is, it moves in a certain way. You may start on a public post and then it may move to direct messages. It may move to email exchanges. It may then take the next step and go into a phone conversation. You know what, this would be easier if we talked on Zoom. There's this trajectory that happens, whether consciously or not, we're moving towards face-to-face meeting. And now that I'm kind of wrestling through that with it, I think, and I know that humans are driven and like the desire for connection is always there. And so it's interesting and important for us to think about how that happens online. So this trajectory is constantly happening, and we need to appreciate that it's happening and think about it. So it could be what we call as the journey, the customer journey, somebody's journey with us, how they come on, and that gets to on-ramps later. But this trajectory engagement is so important to understand because it's simple, but people are always moving there. So let's talk about being there. So local social is very important for awareness. And so I'm going to get pretty practical here. So if you want to engage your city, often we want to think about building a page, building our profile, getting out there and just starting to put out content into the world. The reality is that pages don't reach people that well. Social proof is more important than ever, which means people are looking for word of mouth and they're looking for an organization that they can trust. So join existing communities is very important. You don't have to force a new group. Oftentimes groups already exist within your community. For us, and I'll get to point 2 here on the next slide, first is local groups already exist on Facebook. And homework for anyone watching this webinar would be to go search out what groups might already exist. You may already be a part of them, but city name plus news is a way that I found several that exist already in our neighborhood here. So I was able to find West County news. I was able to find Ellisville news. It just helps you find people that are already in your community talking about things because it's important to them. And if you are trying to serve a city or a region, it's important to know what people are talking about, but also join those conversations. This is more of a tactic, engagement pods. As you're trying to build a following or build connection with people, it's important to appreciate the fact that algorithms are a little biased towards content that gets engagement. So this engagement pod concept is, do you have a group of local businesses or people within your church that can game the system a little bit to help you appear more often in other posts? Oftentimes you'll see businesses commenting on people's posts locally, and they do that because it helps get them in front of more people. So whether you go on as an individual or as a business, having more likes, having more comments on your content helps it to rise in the algorithm. Instagram and Facebook see it as more important. So engagement pods, collecting people locally who you are willing to connect with and say, we need to help each other's content shine locally, is really important. Some people do it in a direct message group on Instagram with 32 different people. And some people do it through Facebook, same thing. So engage your city, search for those opportunities. Stopping there. As you have questions, obviously I want people to be able to leave with answers and not leave with questions. So if you have anything along the way, please pop it in the chat. Moving into the next section, Trevor touched on this, really important with the senses and engaging that, and what he said is very true. It is not the same. And yet it's a reality that we are kind of forced to live in right now, is that a lot of people throughout COVID may have found your church for the first time. They may never step foot in your church, and yet they want to be connected to your church. How do we wrestle with that? How do we move people on the trajectory of engagement? It's something to think about. I don't think we have all the answers here right now. We also know that with regard to the 5 senses, some people will never go into our church. Some people may have not returned yet to our churches in person because of the risk that is involved. And so the community that's built online, the experience in sacred space, and the next steps are really important when we're starting to think about this. So here's how some places have done it, and we can skip this slide. Church online platform is more than streaming to Facebook or streaming to YouTube. What it does is it wraps that video with a chat box that anybody can log into and start a conversation. It also involves live prayer. It gives people an opportunity to break off into one-to-one discussions with hosts that may be there to help anybody struggling with anything. People are looking for connection even when they're find you through a live stream. So it's important, and people are starting to wrestle with this of how we get that engagement, but also be respectful of the fact that the divine service is happening. So how do we build connection around the periphery when people are still looking for that? One solution that has just recently come to my attention is similar to Church Online platform. It's called Altar Live. And so what they're doing, and if you could zoom in on your videos there later on or whatever, you can see that their platform is built similar to Church Online, but they've started allowing people to have watch parties within there. So if their family or friends are at their homes and they're not ready to go back in person, they can watch together and be with people even when they're apart in their own homes. So people are starting to move in this way, and you can start to see by some of the functionality they have. You can also see they have these little chairs around tables, which is built around the service. You think of the narthex for us is where people say, hello, how you doing? And then talk and say, well, have a great day at the end. A lot of important meetings happen in the narthex. They're trying to replicate that right now with church, and you can see people sitting at a table. You can click in and begin having a live conversation with them. So this is an example of just people that are trying to create connection around the service, because that's what people really desire in these hard times. So it's something that we have to think through. How do we provide this for people? Worship online. I am not a pastor or theologically trained in that way. So there are much more thoughts that you need to wrestle with. I've seen some churches begin to appreciate the fact that people at home need help creating a sacred space in their home to make worship something that's more connected. And so some people have done it through churches have created these boxes that people can take home. Included in the boxes would be a candle. Then they encourage you to also to open your hymnal and put it on the table, put a cross on the table. It's more so than just sitting on your couch and kind of passively observing. It's how do you engage the senses? And so is a candle burning helping engage a sense differently? Is creating your environment to be more sacred in a way, helpful to them to be more engaged with the service? How do we help people who are not ready to come back in person yet still engage in worship? So some ideas there. I also think next steps are critically important. And that's something, again, we do on the periphery. You think about the announcements after church or before church when the pastor gets up and explains what's happening. Text options are very important, because if you think about how the person is engaging with the worship service, often at home, they're casting it up onto their TV, watching it through a YouTube app, whatever. So their hands are free, and most likely they have a phone. So a way to engage them right then would be respectful and saying, I know you have a phone. We're not going to tell you to necessarily go to a website or write something down. You can get it right away if you just text this keyword to that number, and we can move you to a next step, which could be filling out a contact form or filling out a registration for an event. So when you're doing your announcement times, involving text with services like textinchurch.com are wonderful ways to help move people and use technology to help move them toward connection. Also, links on page. We kind of talked about how you can build your online campus there with Altar Live or Church Online platform. So you're giving space around the video that people can take next steps, find connection in groups potentially. We've also found stream-only announcements to be very important, because it helps people prepare before just jumping straight into the worship service. And then on the exit, we're also saying thank you, and that we would love it if they could attend with somebody else in the future. It prompts an invite or a share of that content so that people can find our worship service and make connections into our church and our church community. So there's a lot of tech out there and a lot of different ways that you can get overwhelmed. So my experience and our experience as a church was saying, you know what, we are guides, but it's also very important to stay healthy. There's a recent movie called Social Dilemma, if you haven't had a chance to see it, that kind of contends that the social media algorithms are not unbiased and they're constantly trying to go after you. So creating space and creating healthy boundaries is really important. So keeping Christ at the center for us in the fall looked like holding a social media detox. And it happened to be over one of our nation's large events, which was the election. It kind of wrapped that event, because we know that, and we've seen in the past historically, that conversations around there are not always beneficial to each other, our spirits, etc. We also felt as a congregation that we were in a space where we all needed to take a breath. In the midst of COVID, we're probably all on our screens more than ever. And so we involved ourselves in a 21-day social media detox. This was not a technology detox. This was not a internet detox. This was specifically a social media detox, because we found ourselves facing people who are struggling with depression, struggling with anxiety, who were scattered and would end up, and myself included, thumbing through social media, kind of unaware of that we're doing it, and then hours passed and you kind of lose that time forever. So we wanted people to have space. That 21 days is time to walk away with other people and be in the Word, be in prayer, and be present with the people around you. So we created a worksheet that helped people kind of go dark or go limited if people had to stay connected with their job. And then we talked about how to change your patterns, how to change some phone settings so that you're not overwhelmed with you or it's not coming at you. So how do we tried to help people from our congregation and then beyond change their habits in a way that created balance for them in their lives. If you want to find out more about that, you see the link there. I think it's really important, and one of my favorite little sayings, let's see, it's a contemporary take on St. Teresa of Avila, her well-known prayer, Christ has no body. And again, this is a Meredith Gould content here, but Christ has no online presence but yours, no blog, no Facebook page but yours. Yours are the tweets through which love touches this world. Yours are the posts through which the gospel is shared. Yours are the updates through which hope is revealed. Christ has no online presence but yours, no blog, no Facebook page but yours. And I don't do that to like make people feel bad or think it. I just want people to be reflective on what they're posting and what they're engaging with. Are the things that we share reflecting Christ? Are we showing his light through how we engage, the tone that we take with people? Are we leading with answers, or are we giving people reason to ask us why we're so hopeful? And so little things like this, like Christ has no online presence but yours, help me reflect even when I go away from it and fall into bad habits again. So on-ramps, and I'll stop here. I'll touch real quickly on this. Again, back to the trajectory of engagement. So people are moving all the time. On-ramps look like this. There's 4 and more. The website is really important. The website is one thing that you own. We do not own our Facebook pages. We do not own our Twitter handles. Those can be taken away from us at any time. It is important to tell the story of your congregation and your community and what you're all about on your website, and to do it well, and to think about how search engines go after it. So this isn't a presentation on search engine optimization, but that's something important to research, because when you think again about that 0 moment of truth, when somebody is actually looking for a church, what comes up on their Google search results is their order of priority. So it's important for us, and to keep Christ in the center. I purport that we keep him in the center by respecting the fact that this technology connects people to community. These services connect people to the community. So I feel it's important for them to connect to our communities. So I always try to push that. Search engines are very important. There's one term I'd like you to look up. It's SERP, SERP. This may be for a large percentage of people, their only touch with your congregation. And that is our search engine results page. When somebody Googles our church, what shows up? Is there 1 3-star review with nobody else talking about it? Are there pictures that they can look through to understand where they're going, what the building looks like, who your people are, what are some of the ministries? So Google your church, find out what it looks like when people find you, and start to think about how can we better tell the story of our congregation so that people want to take the next step. And then local social media, I already talked about that. We're creating opportunities. And that's through relationship building around affinity groups, like location, like hobbies, because there are conversations that happen that surprise us. And so we need to be ready for that. It's okay to follow your hobbies and be passionate about those, because that's what people connect around. They're not asking questions about how do I find salvation today? They may be asking, how do I better fertilize my garden? And so it's okay to connect with people on those relationships first. And finally, your members. I think it's really important to give our members the right language, give them ways to invite people through social media or through cards that they hand people or whatever it is. Engaging your members and giving them opportunities to share an invite is so important. And there are plenty of ways to do that. So finally, what's next? This is what we're gonna have to wrestle with, among other things in the near future, is private social networking. People are moving to TikTok, Snapchat, etc. Signal is a big one coming up. People are moving away from public posting and moving more to connecting privately. What does that mean for us? How is that going to affect the way that we are able to engage with people? Virtual reality is not ubiquitous yet. People are not a headset in every house, but are we far away from that? Is how do we wrestle with that? And then especially with all Trevor's considerations about engaging the senses. And then everyone prunes. People will unfollow. People are trying to streamline. I think everyone went way too wide in what they followed early on. And as they go, they're saying, what can I let go of? And I think we have to understand that and then help guide people towards healthier balances in their lives. So with all of this, it's just, for me, this is how we keep Christ in the center. We focus on community happens online. We respect that. we stay healthy ourselves, and then we appreciate the on-ramps that technology enables us to bring people into community.
Thank you so much, both Seth and Reverend Sutton, for your time. We really just appreciate it. And, you know, you guys covered so many topics. It's really hard to say, wow, you guys just did that in like 45 minutes and now I have everything figured out. And, you know, for us here, especially at Lutheran Church Extension Fund, we recognize that this is something that the church at large is wrestling with. And so we really wanted the opportunity to at least give this platform and hear and see and know that your congregation is not alone, or if you're a pastor listening or whatever the case might be, that you're not the only one kind of wrestling with this. And we actually address this in our latest version of Interest Time, which both of you were a part of, and we thank you for that. And I would encourage you, as another resource, if you haven't seen it, it's online for free, or you can subscribe and get one at home for free. But at this time, we do have a few minutes. If you have any questions that you'd like to drop into the chat feature, we'll try and see if we can answer those. Again, there was just so much information. I don't even know where to start. But I think one of the things that I want to start with is, as others may continue to digest this, is, you know, you both use the word wrestle a lot throughout the presentation. And I'm curious from you, especially Reverend Sutton, you know, what are maybe some dangers as we wrestle with both the church and technology that you think would be to think about?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest dangers, and technology and speed seem to go together, and the rapidity of new technology coming in, and then the lack of time we have to reflect on the full theological, sociological, anthropological ramifications of it. And so McLuhan, apparently I read him a lot, but he says technology is often put out before it is thought out. And I think there's counsel for the church there too, and just advice for us of let's not put it out or engage it until we think it out. But the problem then is you know, I think Seth's points are great in that it moves so fast in the world that we might be, you know, working on the printing press when the world is working on virtual reality. And so there's this tension between keeping up with the world so we can be conversant with it, but also being reflective and cautious. So it's especially this year, it feels like technology and the integration of it has gone on hyperdrive.
Yeah.
I was at a meeting recently, and somebody at the meeting said, have you heard about this thing Zoom? And I remember just being like, I have, yes. But it was just, it felt like such an antiquated question. But really, if you think about chronologically, I really wasn't using Zoom that much until about a year ago. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think at the same time, would you say, and Seth, feel free to chime in here too. I mean, as we think about congregations who, I mean, how do you stay in touch, or how do you keep up? Would you recommend, you know, not every congregation has a marketing person, or, you know, it's a lady who really is just very present on social media. And so they've asked her to be the social media person. And they're still trying to wrestle with those things. You know, is there, who could they be reaching out to start this maybe network, or to at least have a resource to start with as they think about these things that you guys brought up?
Absolutely. Yeah. One place to start, and this is kind of a plug, would be we have a group on Facebook called Lutheran Communicators. And if you search that, we are trying to stay up to date as best we can all the time, especially when COVID first struck, the group grew. There were a lot of people trying to figure out technology very fast. And I believe we were able to make connections to the right people when they needed to figure out technology. So Lutheran Communicators has been a helpful group. And then to answer your question directly, I think I used to work for Michigan District in Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and I found circuits to be very important. Winkles are great because it keeps the pastors all connected, but I think there's also some staffing at the churches that need to network as well. And there's maybe some shared resources there. At least on our school side, there are some local churches, and I'm sorry, I'm digging all over the place. There are some churches that connect and try to share resources in the communication, advertising, marketing world to raise awareness collectively, because when we all come together, we can share more best practices rather than being in silos. So if you're looking for an immediate close connection, it would be district and circuit. And yet there are also a myriad of groups that can be in your same context that may be helpful to you as well. I do think a person or somebody with a marketing background or communication background is a good place to start, because they can help you ask the right questions. And maybe that leads to a committee or a task force at your church. Maybe that just leads to that person taking on everything. But that you always want to be wary of siloing one person into a full responsibility like that.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. I think it's, I'm often hearing just that practical standpoint of we don't even know where to begin. And as the reality of those senses that Reverend Sutton was referring to, as we think about that moving forward and what the church is going to look like, I think it's really important to know and to recognize that it will not ever be the same, and there will be some long-term impacts to technology, and that doesn't always mean negative. It's positive. And how do we capture that and share the gospel in light of all of those things that ultimately God has given us through technology? So I think that's really important. So I want to thank you both very much for joining us, and for all of those who are listening. We really appreciate it. And again, my name is Rahema with Lutheran Church Extension Fund. And thank you again, Seth. Thank you, Reverend Sutton, and God's blessings to everyone. And we hope you have a great day.